We're always glad when our family comes home. We're always glad when our family wants to come home.
Amen.
It's a thrill to see them. Wound up on the front row, didn't you?
Yeah.
There you go. All right. If you will, look with me for a moment out of the book of Psalms, chapter 67. We're going to read one verse, verse 16. Psalm 67, verse 16. Come and listen, all you who fear God. Let me tell you what He has done for me. This is God's word for God's people.
Thanks be to God.
I want to take a moment this morning and share with you where I've come from. Share with you what our journey, what God has done in my life, how God changed my life. And if you're looking for drugs and alcohol, rehab and all that, it's not there. I was a typical little kid that grew up in a Baptist home. My parents were 3/4 serious of the Baptist church, I guess, of the church we went to. If there was a visiting preacher, we chose not to go. So as a young boy, I began to learn that maybe church wasn't that important. But I continued with my family to church until I got older. I remember when I thought I was saved, or when I went through the motions of being saved. I was about 16, and my brother decided that he was going to give his life to Christ, and he was 4 years older than I am. 6.5 years older than I am. Thank you. I was trying to think right quick. I knew he was a little older than I was. And he was going to make his profession of faith that night at church. And my dad, who must have been 48 or maybe 50 at that time, told me that afternoon, he said, I would love to see both of my boys saved in my lifetime. And I thought, the way he talked, he was about to die. He was getting old. He was 50. And so I thought, well, I'll make my dad happy. So I walked the aisle with my brother that night. And I was no more making a profession of faith than the man in the moon. I was pleasing my dad. And so I went through life for a little while, and went into Vietnam when I was 19 or almost 20, and was over there. And I grew up in a church where you didn't drink. I wasn't around it growing up. I had an uncle that drank considerably, and we weren't around him that much. But I grew up believing that if you drank, you went to hell. It was just kind of like Monopoly. You don't pass go, you don't get another chance. If you drink, you go to hell. So that was the way I was raised. I did that all the way through high school. Never took a drink. Never took a smoke of a cigarette. Still haven't yet. Never dipped snuff. Everybody thinks cowboys dip snuff, but I never did dip snuff or Copenhagen or Skoal or anything like that. I didn't chew tobacco. My dad chewed tobacco quite a bit, but that was one of the habits I didn't get. But I went through Vietnam, and I was still, all during that tour, I didn't want to drink. I didn't want to go to hell. And then I thought to myself about 10 months in, man, you're already in hell. You might as well have a good time. So I began to take a little drink. The guys would get ready to go home, and I would want to be a part of their party, so I would drink a little whiskey with them. And probably, while I was in Vietnam, I probably drank that much whiskey. I was really putting it down, but I probably drank that much. And when I came back, it was just not a part of my life. And so I was just back to Cokes and Dr. Peppers, and that was just my life. There was nothing fabulous about it other than meeting her and knowing her and getting married. Mary and I, we were dating in high school, and we got engaged while I was in the Army, and she was waiting on me. I was writing her every day in Vietnam, and she was writing me back, and you know, the whole love story thing. And I came out of the service, and we got married in August and began to have a career there shortly after with Dow Chemical. Our kids began to come along. We were not involved in church. Growing up in the Baptist church, her being in the Catholic faith, we just stayed out of church. It just wasn't that important to us. And so as our kids began to come along, as Nicole and maybe Jim began to be 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, we began to realize we need to get our kids in church. We need to get them involved. And so we wound up going in a little Methodist church for a little while, or maybe we'd visit a little Baptist church or something, but we weren't serious. And all through life, we began to think we wanted to go back to East Texas. We were living down on the coast at that time. We wanted to go back to East Texas. And so I found a way to go to work for the Texas Department of Corrections. And we came to Palestine, and I went to work at the Cofield unit as a field boss. And I knew that was not a job that I was wanting to take and stay with and make a career out of. But it was a job to get us to East Texas on. And so we still weren't real serious about church. We may go occasionally, but not very often. But as the time grew on, and I've got stories I can tell you as being a field boss, but we're not going to go into that. But as time went on, I was there about a year and finally got involved and got hired on at a ranch called Nature's River Ranch out of Frankston. And this was a job that I was really enthused about. I just loved the ranch. And we went to work there, and we were on one side of the Nature's River, and they had a registered Bremer operation on the north side, the east side of the river. I had commercial cattle on the west side of the river. There was about 1,100 acres there, and it was just wonderful. Our kids grew up, and they were showing calves and different animals, and they were helping us on the ranch, and they were getting on the horses and doing all the things that the kids would do. And the owner of the ranch came to me, and he said, "Jim, I'm selling your side of the ranch." And I thought, okay. And he said, "But the owner wants you to stay and take care of it for him." I said, "Great, I'd love to." And so it was about 2 weeks maybe before I met the owner. We had talked a couple of times on the telephone, but it was a couple of weeks before I met him, and he came down and he began telling me of the dreams that he had, and the dreams that began to, I guess, fill my life. He wanted to build this tremendous house for him, 4,000 something square foot weekend home, and he wanted to put it right in the middle of our hay meadow. Yeah, and the kids had a go-kart track and the rest of that hay meadow. And he was going to build us a brand new brick home, and he did. We went down that day he was there, and he bought me a brand new truck, big Chevrolet truck. We bought trailers. We did the whole thing. And he said, "Now we need to put you some money in the bank." And some of y'all got a little piece of this last week, but he said, "We need to put you some money in the bank." So he put $20,000 in the bank. Now we're talking about 30 years ago. That's a pretty good chunk of change for a country boy. And he said, "Now when you run out of that," he said, "you call and I'll send some more." So his idea, his plans were for that to be the biggest, the best, the prettiest cattle operation you could imagine. He wanted to take down all the wooden pens, put up new pipe pens, get all of that built, building those two houses at the same time. He wanted to top every sale that you could imagine. He wanted his name out there, Summer Tree Ranch. He wanted his name out there. We were taking registered Bremer cattle, and we were buying Hereford bulls, the top Hereford bulls, and putting on those registered Bremer cattle. We had plans to have a tremendous F1 herd. So we were topping sales, buying bulls. They knew that we were there to buy a bull, and we were going to get the ones we wanted. We wanted the top one. We were buying horses. He was bringing horses in that had a filly there. Some of you may not remember Zanpar Bar fillies. He had the world champion reigning mare there she was bred and was fixing to have a colt. We had all kind of horses you couldn't imagine. He bought a cutting horse down south somewhere on his own. He didn't know anything about horses. He didn't know anything about cattle. He bought a cutting horse that probably had never been in a cutting pen. He couldn't understand why that horse didn't cut. Things were going tremendous. Things were going great. We were getting known around Frankston. We had just started getting involved in the Frankston United Methodist Church when all this began to take place and began to happen. Well, he would come in on the weekends and he'd want to play and he'd want to see things. And I stayed home from church and began to neglect church and started going with him. And this rocked on for a while, and things were going well. Everything was being built and taken care of just like he wanted. And I was doing just what he wanted. This man had no idea what it takes on a ranch. When he came in and I met him those first 2 weeks, I'd sold some bunch of calves. We just weaned, and I'd sold those, and I remember handing him a check when he met me. I handed him a check for $67,000. And he said, "What's that for?" And I said, "We just sold some calves." "Well, how often can we do that?" And I said, "Well, about every year, thereabouts." I said, they'll be dropping some calves here for long." "You mean these cows are already having calves?" And I said, "These cows are bred and they're fixing to start having calves." And he couldn't understand the concept, so he knew nothing about the operation of the ranch. But I was slowly following him along. I was slowly getting out of what we had started in the church. We were trying to get into Sunday school. I was trying to sit there with our middle son who wouldn't go into a class, and he was about 4 years old, and he'd sit on my knee in that adult class.
He was 2 and he would die if he heard you say
He was 2 and he would die. Time gets away from you when you get a bunch of years on you. But we were trying to get involved, but as he come down, and he was taking more and more of my time, and I was following him instead of following God. And I ran out of money shortly after that, and I was scared to death. I didn't know what to do. I'd never called anybody and asked them for money. And I called up to his office, and he was skiing somewhere in Colorado. And I told the girl who I was, and she said, "Do you need some money?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I do." And she said, "Well, Carl said to send you $20,000 again if you need it." So there was $20,000 more in the bank. I was paying bills, paying feed, utilities, all kinds of stuff. Just going through the money. Getting to be known all around Frankston. And then one day, Carl came in and he said, "Jim, I'm going to make some changes." And I thought, what are we going to do with the cows now? What kind of cow does he want? And he said, "I'm going to let you go." And I have never been let go of in a job in all my life. I was devastated. I had gone from Mr. Somebody, and all of a sudden I was beginning to look to where I was headed. And he said, "Take your time. Find the place you need to." He said, "I'll pay you till you find what you need." So I went looking, went to Weatherford and different places trying to find a ranch where I was supposed to be. Instead of trying to ask God, "God, where do you want me? God, where do I need to be?" I began looking to see where I needed to be. And it wound up about 30 miles from us. I found a little Bremer operation that was needing someone to run it. Before I took that job, there was a place called the Murchison Ranch, Glad Oaks Ranch, that I'd heard of, and they were needing somebody, but I thought, no, I'd found this one on my own. And I didn't really even check into it. And we got over there, and the guy was showing us, this was a mom and dad, the one that owned it, the son that owned it lived in England. And they began showing us around their cattle operation, and they had a bunch of cows, bunch of Bremer cows. And he said, now we've got a house right over here. He said, let's go, I'll go show you the house. Now I want you to remember that we came from a very nice 3-bedroom brick home with a very nice truck and a very nice bank account. And he brought us and took us over there and showed us a little frame home. Somebody try to get that one. Or is that the time to go? Maybe time to go. But he showed us a little frame home. We looked at it. It seemed nice. You know, I think it would work, be fine. So we took the job, and in a week or two, whenever we started, we moved in. And I think it was about the first day we were there, we realized that for some reason, he had taken that house and picked it up and moved it somewhere else and brought another old shack in and put it there instead. Now, he really didn't. But what we saw was not what we got. What I saw was not as bad as what we got. Have you ever been there? You ever saw something, been there, and it looks pretty good, and you step out and grab it, and it wasn't near as good as you thought it was? When we would sit down to eat in that little place, if you had bean juice or soup or something, you had to watch it because it would roll off your plate into your lap. The house was unlevel. The house didn't look near as good as I thought it did a week before. I was ashamed for our parents to come by and visit with us, to see where we were and where we're at now. Our kids probably didn't think anything about it. But it was very humbling to be brought from something way up here, and all of a sudden, here you are, and this is it. I went to work there, and grudgingly seemed like every day. I just hated it. They had lots of Bremer cattle, heifers, and young bulls. They'd have 40, 50 animals in a 2 or 3 acre trap. And the animals would stand there waiting for feed. Wasn't any grass to eat. They were just fed everything they got. If you know anything about the Bremer cattle, they'd have the white switch on the tails instead of all black. They'd have a pink nose instead of a black nose. And they were keeping these animals. They were thinking these were going to be some terrific bulls and what have you, that people were going to just fall all over. But I knew enough to know that these animals were not what buyers were going to be looking for. I tried to tell them a little bit, tried to help do something, but they didn't want to. This was surprise animals. Their herd bull, Bremer bull that they had, was a good bull, but his old dew claws were beginning to grow over, hadn't been taken care of. And I told them one day, I said, if we don't trim that old bull's feet, I said, he's going to come up crippled. And I said, then you've got a mess. Well, let me check with my brother. So, in the meantime, I had begun to kind of look. I was trying to find something. I needed out of there. That was not where Jim and Mary were supposed to be. Well, the man came back to me the next day and he said, well, my brother said, if we were to get that old bull down and trim his hooves, it'd make him mean. And his brother was a peanut farmer. And I said, okay. So I began to talk to him at the Murchison Ranch, at the Glad Oaks Ranch, where I was kind of led to go the first time, but I didn't. I did it on my own. I found this. I didn't need anybody to help me. I found it. And so I called and arranged to talk to him on a Saturday over there at the Glad Oaks Ranch. And I talked to the general manager and was visiting with him, and they were needing somebody to be a foreman on the cattle operation there at the Glad Oaks Ranch. And so they hired me. And that was the best move that could have ever been made. One of the best moves in our life. That was a dream. I couldn't imagine being put in a place like this. This was Clint Murkison's operation. If any of you remember Clint Murkison, he owned the Dallas Cowboys for years. I was working for his family. Clint Murkison had 4 ranches in that area. The one I was on, there was 10,000 acres. He had another one right down the road about 15 miles, had 5,000 acres, another one, another 7,000 or 8,000 acres that he wanted a poker game. But there was close to 50,000 acres there between those 4 ranches. We had 10,000 acres. We ran about 1,200 mama cows. We'd run about 400 yearlings on cover crop through the winter. And this guy wanted to make money. It wasn't about spending all that you can. It was about making something. He said, I don't care at the end of the year if you come ahead $1. He said, I want the ranch to pay for itself. And so that's what we were doing. We were making decisions. I had 2 young men, 2 Mexican boys, a father and son that worked for me. The dad didn't speak any English. He knew how to curse in English, but he didn't speak English. I learned a little Spanish at that time. I believe the first Sunday, or maybe the second Sunday we were on that ranch, that 10,000 acres, you could get on a horse on one end of it and ride and never get off the property. Beautiful. There was about 3,500 acres in woods. The rest of it was pasture and hay meadows. Just beautiful. Rolling hills. Maybe the second Sunday we were there, we found this little church. I promise you, it's set right in the middle of Glad Oaks Ranch. They were 4 blacktops heading to that little church. It was called Union United Methodist Church. And we were decided we were going to go to church there. And we went to that little church, and it was 20, 25 on a good Sunday. That first Sunday we were there, this couple that was in the church, Shorty and Glenda Hawkham, invited us home for lunch. And we went home for lunch, and we were at their table on Sunday, or they were at our table on Sunday. For the rest of the time we were there. They became the kind of friends. They became the kind of people that you want to put yourself around. Their whole family was that way. They had a dad by the name of Pink Hawkham. Mr. Pink Hawkham was probably the most godly man I'd ever met. I know I was put right there because of Pink Hawkham. Pink Hawkham was the kind of a man that was crippled up with arthritis. His hands and his fingers were bent. He hadn't been able to straighten in years, and he walked this way. We went into that church, and I knew that God had something for us there. I didn't know what. But as we began, they wanted me to help with a youth group. I began helping with the kids. And the first thing you know, they wanted me to teach a Sunday school class. I couldn't teach a Sunday school class. I never taught anything like that in my life. And I would sit in stand at the first pew, and there were about 3 or 4 pews of older adults. They were all 60 and over. I mean, they were way out there. Just teasing. They weren't that old now that I look back. But that was the wisdom of the church that was sitting there. And I began trying to teach, and I'd go through this lesson, and the first thing you know, I'd get right in the middle of something, and man, it would hit me. It was talking right directly to me. And I couldn't even finish the lesson. I'd wind up crying. God was doing something in my life, and I didn't know what it was. I was right where I wanted to be. I was right where God wanted me to be. I was doing the things that I loved. I was horseback. I was working cattle. We were doing, it was, our kids were, it was right where I wanted. I loved it. One summer, I was baling hay. That's where the cab of that tractor came from. I'll never forget that cab of that John Deere tractor. We were in a long meadow. We called it the horseshoe meadow. It was probably 400 yards long, and it made a big circle around a kind of a slough, and it came back another 400 yards. It was just a huge horseshoe that we called it. Joaquin was breaking hay. I was in the cab. I remember that, had that air conditioner on. I was a pretty good guy back then. I didn't hog the cab tractor. I would swap out with Joaquin about every day. I'd rake. His dad was ahead of us cutting somewhere. I'd rake and let Joaquin enjoy the cab, the air conditioning. But that day I was in the cab of that John Deere tractor, and I was starting down that long horseshoe meadow. Had WBAP on the radio. Remember WBAP? Country Western, boy. Had that air conditioner set over on about number 3. I mean, it was nice. WBAP just cranking in my ear. All of a sudden, there became some static on that radio. I punched another country and western station in, and it was static. I went over, was just working the dial as I was working with the hay. I was working that dial. Had to have the music. Well, all that radio was putting out was static. And I reached up and cut it off. And when I cut it off, God turned on. I don't know if it was in my ear, if you could hear it. I don't know if God got it to my mind. I don't know if it was audible. I don't know if it was, I don't know what it was.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. But God began to talk to me and began to tell me all the things that I was about to do. And I didn't understand any of them. And then he began to tell me the things I was going to stop doing. That went on for almost 400 yards. And the reason I know that, we had started on and just turned around, was headed out. And when I realized where I was at and what was going on, I was at the far end of that meadow.